23rd Psalm again, and probably in a version or translation we all might be a little more used to. Bruce read today from our Lectern Bible, which is the New Revised Standard Version, and probably my favorite version. I'm glad that it's the one we use here at this church because it's also the one that I've used in seminary for many years as well, so I can relate to it and my professors relate to it as well. There are a lot of good translations out there. And I will tell you that though I grew up with one in my house and even in my bedroom, I'm no longer a really big fan of the King James Version, and there's a lot of reasons for that that I won't go into now. But there are parts of it I do think really get it right, or at least we find more comforting because we're used to that. I learned a while back from a mentor of mine that when you use the 23rd Psalm, especially at a funeral, always go with the King James Version. It's the one that people have memorized. It's the one they will recognize the most. And when you're there with people from different denominations and faiths and you want to say it communally together, that this is the one that most people will gravitate to. So I'd like to read that to you again. It's really not very different from Bruce's version that he read, but there are some words that are a little different. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. We've heard this psalm so often in our lives before. It often comes at very profound moments. We say it at funerals, at tough times when we're struggling with something. During hospital visits, it's often one of my go-to verses or scriptures to use. I can remember visiting Ada Schneck in the Pottsville Hospital when she was home and ended up in the hospital. Ada didn't really know me, but knew I was a pastor. And when I asked her if she'd like me to read from the Bible or say a prayer, she of course said yes, as Ada would. And I began with the 23rd Psalm, and Ada said every word by heart. She couldn't do other things. She wasn't quite sure where I belonged, though she'd known me before, but she could still recite the 23rd Psalm, and that was a powerful connection to us. It is right and good to use this psalm in those times. I'm not here today to talk about this in too much of a different way, though the sermon title kind of tells you I want to add a little more to it and not change the psalm in any way, but maybe offer a new perspective to an old and sacred verse of Scripture. I'm sometimes afraid that we lose some of the meaning in it by only saving it and using it for certain times in our lives. This is a psalm for many occasions, not just for sad occasions, not just for profound moments in our life. This is a psalm of good news, really, not a way to end the time of someone's life, not just to reassure us that they will dwell with God forever. There's good news in this message for all of our life, from the beginning to the end. If we don't talk about it as good news, then we're really not acknowledging that we have a good shepherd. We need to talk about the beginning and the end, but also the middle as well. Often we hear that first line, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And we only hear that part. God is in charge and God will provide for me. So many people use this as a way into going off into sermons just on that one verse. The Lord is my shepherd and I shall not want. It's often called the prosperity gospel, where people preach that the more money you give to the church, or if you just accept Jesus, everything in your life will be right. And if you only stop at this verse, that's the message you might get. But there's more to this as well. Being a sheep in a flock and knowing we have a shepherd. Even skipping ahead to the other line or verse most remembered, The one at the very end, I will dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. Or in the King James Version, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I know that when I speak that at funerals, people find comfort in it, that they are reassured that their loved one is in eternity. Again, it's good to do that and right to use it that way. It is not an incorrect use of that verse. However, as biblical commentator Joel Lamont writes, there is a risk of thinking that the 23rd Psalm as a sentimental version rather than speaking it with a bold message of good news. If we only break it out in those times, we don't see the power of it to speak to us over and over again in our life and the boldness of what it is really saying. Yes, it's comforting, but it's also really a striking piece of literature. The images are beautiful, of course, but they are more than that. They are provocative. They provoke us into a new way of thinking upon close study. There is still a fresh word from God in these verses. It is not done speaking to us just because we continue to use a version written centuries ago. This psalm is about a journey. It's not about a marking of an end of time or even an occasion. It has the images and words of walking and resting and being restored and so on. But what kind of journey is it that the psalmist is on? What is actually happening to him as he writes about this experience? In the scripture, the word follow here is actually a Hebrew word called radaf. And that can be translated as pursue, which is a surprising thing because in most of the rest of the Psalms, or at least I'll say throughout the Psalms, the thing that is pursuing the psalmist is their enemies. They are in pursuit of them to take them over, to conquer them, to envelop him with everything they have, and for him to submit to them. Yet even in the same verse, the word surely is actually also better translated to mean only. So when we say, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, which is a wonderful thing to hear, it might more accurately be spoken, only goodness and mercy will be chasing me down. That's what it really means when the psalmist wrote it. Not that we will be pursued by our enemies and God will follow up afterwards, which is a theme in a lot of other psalms, the rescue of God. There's a whole litany of psalms that are about that very theme. Only goodness and mercy will be chasing me down. But what follows that? Only goodness and mercy will be chasing me down until I pass to eternity and rest in the house of the Lord? No, that's not what that part's saying either. The word dwell here in Hebrew is actually the word shuv. In this instance, scholars believe that shuv, that Hebrew word, indicates in its most simplest form a sense of returning or to turn to something. So given the images of a journey that we have, this traveling going on in the psalm, it might be better read, that very last verse, verse 6. Instead of saying, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Our commentator that I read for today, a biblical scholar, and many, many other scholars think that upon close inspection of the context and the times that the psalmist was writing about, reading it in community with all the other psalms and understanding the Hebrew language, that it actually is saying something more like, only goodness and mercy will be chasing me down. I will continually return to God's presence my whole life long. That's what it's really saying. It's not just a message to remind us that our loved ones live in eternity with God, but it reminds us that we are to pursue returning to God our whole life. And in doing so, mercy and goodness will chase us down. Not that we will always receive it, but that is the work that we will always be doing. Seeking after God's presence is a lifelong process and a long-term journey, one that we often have to return to. It's really hard to stay in that position. We should take note also that when we read this, when we read the Psalms, we're reading about the Jewish faith. And in the Jewish faith, and I'm not sure I can still explain this in the best way, but I could use it, I guess, as a contrast to the way I know many Christians think. In Christianity, so often our focus is on the entrance to heaven. We do what we can here. We receive God's grace because ultimately, for many of us, our focus is on wanting to get to heaven, whether we like to admit that or not. Sure, we believe in grace. Of course we believe in grace. And grace is received no matter what you do here on earth. But ultimately, so many of us are fixed upon, will we get to heaven? That's not a fixation of the Jewish faith. Their faith is about living it out and practicing it in their daily lives every day. It is about bringing the kingdom of God here to practice their faith. It is a very practical faith. It is one that they are living in now, not doing things so that they can live somewhere else later. That's not to say there's no concept of an afterlife for our Jewish friends. They debate those things just as much as Christians do. But they look at their everyday lives in a much different way than many Christians do. So you have to read this psalm knowing that the person writing it was Jewish and not Christian. That they would have been reminding themselves that they have to return to God's presence their whole life long, rather than reassuring people of how to get to heaven. This journey has paths, we're told in the psalm, and the word for paths used here is Magalim. I hope I'm saying that right, but when this word Magalim appears in the rest of Hebrew texts, it means something along the lines of ruts. These aren't just paths like the Appalachian Trail or walking path at a park. These are deep paths in the Hebrew text that are made by the wheels of carts, often ox carts. They're heavily traveled. They're grooves, if you will, that are hard to get out of once you're on the right path. They are well worn. And again, as I said, when you're really in them, hard to find your way out of them, though it happens. But how do we get into those grooves? How do we get on those right paths, those ruts in our life that are good ones? Ones that have been traveled for so long. The paths are there laid before us. It's nothing new what we're trying to do or what Jesus is calling us to do. But it is often radical once we get out of those paths for a little bit of time. We find ourselves out of them and we work our way back into them, hoping that we can stay in those grooves for even longer. Both in our life as a church and in our individual lives. For those of us who kind of can separate the two, it's hard for someone like me to do that, and I don't really try to do that. My life as a Christian is my life. To get into the groove of right living, or what many might say the righteous groove, we live and act and sustain and pursue righteous relationships. And again, in our Bible, in Scriptures, righteous is a concept of justice. With ourselves, with our community, and with God. We pursue those relationships that seek justice, that seek right living between God, between community, and between each other. We do things, as the psalm tells us, for His name's sake. In other words, what we are doing is not only because of God, but it is a way that glorifies God. What we are doing protects God's reputation, if you will. How often have you heard in your life criticisms of Christians that are doing things in Christian name that can't possibly, or people wonder if they can possibly be what God would do? What we do in His name affects the reputation of God. It's not an easy burden to carry. But how do we do that? What are the things we're supposed to do? I will tell you that we just put up a few weeks ago, maybe it's only a week ago now, I kind of lose track of time sometimes, in our banner in front of our church. Those are the ruts we should get into. To reject oppression, to take care of the poor, to enjoy life. All those things and many others are written on the banner out front of what it means to be a church. Those are the things. Those are the righteous relationships in the world. There's more besides what's on that banner, but if we just work on those, we'll be busy for quite some time and be on a journey ourselves. We need to find ourselves and our church along this journey. Resting, being restored, moving, all in a way that we are considering all the time that what we do as Christians, what we do as a church, promotes the reputation of God in our world. If we get it wrong, God is still God, as we talked about last week, but there are consequences for that at times, and we have to go into that being fully aware of it. But when we get it right, we should enjoy that moment and understand that what we have done is helped the reputation of God. Sounds funny that that needs to be done, but you and I both know from looking at the news every day that that does need to happen in our world. It's not an easy journey. This journey, if we read this psalm, doesn't go right from the green pastures and still waters to the house of the Lord. There it is right in the middle, verses 4 and 5. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. We don't skip from the green pastures to the glory of eternity. There's this middle part in which bad things will happen to us. Really bad things. The valley of the shadow of death is not anything to be taken lightly. But there it is, in the valley of the shadow of death, the shepherd with us, with his rod and staff. Not only is God with us in those moments, but God has equipment to help us. And I would submit to you that that equipment, those rods and staffs, are oftentimes other people as well. Maybe to poke and prod, maybe to pull us back in, maybe to gently nudge us in the right direction. But all in the ways that the Good Shepherd would provide. For a final look at this psalm, I'd like to make note of an observation of God's location throughout the whole psalm. We've kind of talked about these verses of it, one against another and each in isolation, but putting it all together, it says something about where God is with us on this journey. We look more for a word of comfort in these individual scriptures, but there's a word of comfort in the whole psalm. What is God's role? Look at the psalm and everywhere where it says he. In the beginning it starts out, he maketh, or he leadeth, or he restoreth. These are things that God is doing without our help, really. It doesn't say God will guide me into green pastures. God will make me lie down in green pastures. God leads us, and God restores our soul. God is doing things to us, nudging us in a way like a shepherd would do. But then in the middle, God shifts their position a little bit. In that valley of the shadow of death, no longer is God out ahead, but it says, for thou art with me. When I think of that, I think of God right beside me. Not only right beside me as a shepherd, but right beside me with that rod and staff to comfort me, whatever they might represent in our lives. And then when we hit the point where we run into enemies, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. To me, I envision a God who has gone out ahead of us and prepared a banquet for us, so that when we get there, God has already done this and taken care of us, is out ahead of those troubles. God does change position in these roles, and that's important to take note, but God is always present. As Christians, we can't just see Jesus as the Good Shepherd tending to us. We can't just stop at that first verse and say that God will provide us with everything we need. God is sometimes ahead of us. God is sometimes behind us, pushing us in a direction, and God is oftentimes right beside us, holding us up. He's also the one who has made the paths, who goes out ahead over and over again, showing us the way as we continually hear the story. I see Jesus not just as the shepherd of the Gospel of John, but also as a trailblazer that we hear about in the book of Hebrews. Jesus has journeyed these paths before us, and they are well worn because we've talked about them for thousands of years, and Christians have experienced them ahead of us. Those ruts are there for us to see, if only we look for those paths. Jesus in his life shows us how to be in right relationship with each other and with God. But yes, there is a risk to it. For Jesus, that path led all the way to the cross. And yet he still calls us to follow him, to put some things to death, to leave them in the valley of the shadow, but yet also to return to the presence of God over and over again, as the last verse tells us. To be resurrected when we put some things or old ways behind us that are no longer working or providing for the sheep as they should. To be resurrected not just for the sake of ourselves, but for the sake of the reputation of God. When we are renewing many churches as we are in this area, or trying to do that thing, we're not just doing it as a matter of our survival. We need to pursue those things as a matter of protecting the reputation of God in our world. The good news of this psalm is that when we walk down these paths of righteousness, that when we pursue justice in our world, we might take a little heat, we might go through some dark valleys. It's not an easy thing to be that church, especially in our area. But we are always walking with God's presence. When we are church, we walk with God. Please join me in a brief prayer. God, if you are with us on our journey, then nothing else matters. God, if you are not with us on our journey, then nothing else matters. Amen.